week 13 of the fantasy football season, and here's running back star to sit every matchup in every game this week. The first matchup, Thursday Night Football, the Buffalo Bills at the New England Patriots. So right here, I got Devin Singletary as a borderline start this week here, because it's going to be a tough ball game versus a good run defense, obviously, in this New England Patriot team. Obviously, we saw Dalvin Cook not do much with only 9 fantasy points in the last ball game for this Minnesota Viking team versus the New England Patriots on Thursday night last week. So right here, Devin Singletary's been pretty decent this season as a number 2 running back, but this week in a tough division matchup, I have him as a borderline option. Now to the Patriots side of things, Ramondre Stevenson, in my opinion, he's one of the better running backs in all fantasy football, and a guy pretty much you could pencil in for 15 plus points weekly, even in a tough matchup versus a good run defense like the Buffalo Bills. He's a guy that could catch the ball out of the backfield, and we saw last week with 9 receptions in that game versus the Minnesota Vikings. So I got him as a start, and Damian Harris, who's banged up right now with an injury, even if he does play, he's a guy I'm going to sit next to the Tennessee Titans at the Philadelphia Eagles. So Derrick Henry last week, not a great game, and the Cincinnati Bengal defense bottled them up, only 14.7 fantasy points for Henry. That's still a decent ball game, but obviously not to his standards. But he's a guy you start each and every week, especially in a crucial week 13. You're going to throw him out there and put him in your starting lineup. Now to the Eagles side of things, Miles Sanders coming off his best game of the season with over 25 fantasy points, where this Eagle run game shredded, obviously, that Green Bay Packers defense, running for over 300 yards as a team. So Miles Sanders, some weeks he's got good weeks, and some weeks he's not going to show up. But here in a home game for Philadelphia, not the greatest of matchups. He's still a guy I'm going to go throw out there and start. Now to the Green Bay Packers at the Chicago Bears. So Aaron Jones, he's been solid over the last few weeks, and he was a top 15 running back drafted this season for a reason. So this week here, I'm going to give him a start once again. A.J. Dillon, he looked good as well versus the Philadelphia Eagles on Sunday Night Football, but I'm still not going to trust Dillon each and every week. I got to see it at least 1 or 2 more times before I put Dillon in the starting lineup. So this week here, Aaron Jones, better receiver, obviously, out of the backfield, more dynamic than A.J. Dillon is the start. And Dillon, if he could do it again next week, because this season he's only got 2 ball games with double-digit fantasy points, then I would start him. But this week, he's a sit. Now to the Bears side of things, David Montgomery, we know he's been getting the workload. We know he's the number 1 running back over there. And after this Packer defense got shredded last week for over 300 yards on the ground by the Eagles, I think Montgomery could put in a solid performance as a number 2 running back for fantasy owners. And I got him as a start this week. Now to the New York Jets at the Minnesota Vikings. So Michael Carter dealing with an ankle injury, but he's day-to-day right now. And if he does play in this ball game, he's obviously going to be the starter, is Michael Carter, and I would give him a start, even though the last couple weeks with injury and a bad ball game a few weeks ago versus the Patriots, he didn't do much. But right now, if he does play in this game versus the Minnesota Vikings in Minnesota, I like him as a start. Now to the borderline options, Zonovan Knight and Todd Johnson, top waiver pickups at the running back position this week. Todd Johnson, we know last week he only had 6 touches in that ball game and still finished with 14.8 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And Zonovan Knight in his season debut went over 100 yards from scrimmage. So right now, even if Carter is out in this game, they're both borderline options to me, are these guys, because we don't know the way the backfield's going to go here for New York. James Robinson, another guy listed, obviously, in this video here. I got him as a sit, but last week he was a healthy scratch for Zonovan Knight and Todd Johnson being active on the roster. But this week here, Robinson, he easily could be the number 1 guy. Obviously, if Michael Carter is not going to play in this game, but I still can't trust him. His performances have been down the last few weeks here, is James Robinson, where we really haven't seen much of him. So he's a sit. And now to the Minnesota Viking things. I know Dalvin Cook, he hasn't had the greatest of seasons for a guy that many fantasy owners took in the mid-first round of the fantasy drafts. But this week here, even with a pretty tough matchup versus a solid Jet D-line, I would give Dalvin Cook the start this week. Now to Jacksonville at the Detroit Lions. Travis Etienne, he left that ball game with a foot injury last week in Week 12, and a great victory versus the Baltimore Ravens for this Jacksonville team. But supposedly they just held him out as a precaution. So obviously if he plays, he's a must-start each and every week. And what a great matchup at the Detroit Lions that obviously don't stop anyone passing, running the football, or anything here. So Etienne, if he plays, is a definite start. And if Etienne's out, JaMycal Hasty I would put in my starting lineup. And he was one of the top waiver wire ads as well this week here. So right now, the backfield over there is a well-oiled machine for this Jacksonville Jaguar team. I know Darrell Henderson's in the mix as well, but we don't know what his role is going to be one way or the other, and we don't know if he's up to snuff yet with the playbook. So Darrell Henderson, yeah, maybe he's a guy you want to roster as a stash, but not a guy I'm going to put in my starting lineup, so he's a sit. And now to the Lions side of things, they have a good two-headed monster back there in the backfield with DeAndre Swift. And these guys, him and Jamal Williams, pretty much they start each and every week in this Lion backfield. And with a great matchup, home once again for this Detroit Lion team versus obviously a Jacksonville Jaguar defense that isn't that great. I would start Swift and Williams as number 2 running back solid options and flex options this week. Now to the Cleveland Browns at the Houston Texans and Deshaun Watson's return. And for him, obviously, his first game back is at his former team. But anyway, this is about the running backs. And Nick Chubb, a monster season. Top 5 running back, no doubt about it, in fantasy football. And he's a guy, he's matchup proof, and you start him no matter what. In this ball game, it wouldn't be surprising to me if he goes over 100 yards with 1 or 2 touchdowns in this one. Kareem Hunt, on the other hand, it hasn't been a good season here for Kareem Hunt. And he's a guy I'm going to sit this week. He just hasn't been consistent. He's not putting up the numbers. And Nick Chubb, he's the alpha right now in that backfield over there for the Cleveland Browns. So I got Hunt as a sit. We just haven't seen enough out of him this season, especially at crunch time now with 2 weeks left in the regular season, to put him in my lineup. And out to the Texan side of things, I know Dameon Pierce, he really hasn't done much over the last few weeks here for this Houston Texan team, but still a guy I could count on as a flex or a number 2 running back, where I think in this ball game he could get 60, 70 total yards and find the end zone. And obviously that's good for 12 to 15 fantasy point range here for Dameon Pierce. So this week here, where we know this Brown defense ain't all that great, and we saw Rachaad White come off a 19-point fantasy game, I got him as a start this week. Now to the Steelers at the Atlanta Falcons. So a lot of factors going on in the Steeler game here. We saw Najee Harris leave with an abdominal injury last week in Monday Night Football versus the Indianapolis Colts. And then we saw Benny Snell come in and have a solid fantasy game with 13 fantasy points. And even Anthony McFarland got into the mix as well. So right now, a lot of options here in the Steeler backfield. So if Najee Harris plays, he's a start. Jalen Warren, he might come back from the hamstring injury. If he's going to start in this game, we'll see. And it just really depends what's going to happen. So obviously, whoever's going to start for this Steelers team, if it's going to be Harris, Warren, or Benny Snell, they're going to be a start for me. And right now, I would stash Snell if he's still out there on your waiver wire for your fantasy roster, because he's a guy that could run in between the tackles. And we saw it a couple seasons ago, him fill in at running back, where he got starting role and he was giving you 12 to 15 fantasy points. Now to the Falcons side of things, Cordell Patterson, he's been hit or miss over the last few weeks since he returned from injury. And I don't really like the options in the backfield right now over there in Atlanta. It wouldn't be surprising if Patterson or Algier have a breakout game. But this week here, Patterson, I have to sit. And Algier right now, he really hasn't been on the fantasy radar. That's why he's not listed right now on this list. Now Denver Broncos at the Baltimore Ravens. So right here with Latavius Murray last week, he had a plus matchup and he didn't really do much in that ball game. And I know it was the game script and it really didn't go his way. So this week here, I have him as a borderline option. Melvin Gordon, obviously, he's out of town. Chase Edmonds, he's hurt with a high ankle sprain. But Mike Boone, he might come back in this ball game. And Marlon Mack's there as well, but we didn't see much out of him. So Latavius Murray in a pretty stiff matchup versus one of his former teams at the Baltimore Ravens. I got him as a borderline option. Now to the Ravens side of things, Kenyon Drake, he was a guy mentioned to drop this week here. We haven't seen much out of him. But if you want to keep him on your roster, he's a borderline option versus a decent matchup here with the Broncos coming to town. And Gus Edwards as well is a borderline option, where you know he's going to get short yardage. You know he's going to get goal line work here. Is Gus Edwards. But right now, a lot of teams are playing this week. Only a few teams on bye here. So Gus Edwards at best is a borderline option. And there's also an opportunity where J.K. Dobbins could come back in this game as well and get some work. So right now, that backfield over there in Baltimore is just tough. So they were all borderline options at best for fantasy owners. Now to the Commanders at the New York Giants. Antonio Gibson, he's been a solid receiver out of the backfield. And a guy still getting a healthy workload for this Washington Commander team. That's won 4 out of 5 ball games since Taylor Heineke's been put into the starting lineup. So right here, Antonio Gibson, I'm going to give him a nod. This Giant defense, I know they did a pretty decent job versus Tony Pollard on Thanksgiving Day versus the Dallas Cowboys last week. But I think Antonio Gibson in this one, just catching the ball out of the backfield and getting a decent amount of carries, could carve out number 2 value. And I got him as a start. And Brian Robinson Jr., I know, had a nice ball game last week one of his best games of his young NFL career. But to me, this is more of an Antonio Gibson type of game, catching the ball out of the backfield and him getting a decent amount of carries. So right now I got Gibson a start and Brian Robinson Jr. a borderline option. And out to the Giants, Saquon Barkley, I know the last few weeks here, the workload's definitely caught up to him and the fantasy numbers have gone down a little bit. But he's still a guy that's top 5 running back potential each and every week. And a guy I'm going to start once again, no doubt about it, versus a mediocre Commander defense. Now to the Dolphins at the San Francisco 49ers. Jeff Wilson Jr., we saw him leave early in last week's victory versus the Houston Texans. But this week here, if he's back, he's going to be a start for me versus his former team. You know, he's want to stick it to them after they traded him away, after bringing Christian McCaffrey into the mix here for this 49 team. So Jeff Wilson in a revenge game and wanting some vengeance, I got him as a starter. Raheem Mostert, he was a scratch last week. He didn't play in the game, and even if he's active, he's going to be a sit for me. But if Jeff Wilson for some reason doesn't play a Mostert, obviously Myles Gaskin is the next man up over there for this Miami Dolphin team. But going off what I know right now, Wilson and Mostert are the guys I'm listing here. Now to the 49ers side of things, CMC, I know it was a down week last week. I know he hyperextended the knee. It looks like he's going to play in this ball game. So obviously, no matter what, he's a top 2, top 3 running back each and every week. I got him as a starter. Elijah Mitchell out 6 to 8 weeks. Obviously, Jared Mason might be the backup running back over here and possibly taking Mitchell's role because they don't want to go over 20 carries with Christian McCaffrey here. But Mason right now, he's not a guy that's on the radar. Yet, if he has a role this week, then he's a guy that'll be on the list. But right now, it's just about CMC and he's a start. Now to the Seattle Seahawks at the Los Angeles Rams, Kenneth Walker, he's pretty much a top 15 running back at worst each and every week. And he's matchup proof in my opinion. A great rookie season, strong running back. We saw last week carry a pile and take it to the house for a touchdown. And he's a start here with this Ram team just banged up, and Aaron Donald might not even play in this one. So right here, Kenneth Walker, he's a start each and every week. Now to the Rams side of things, it's down to Cam Akers and Kyren Williams as the top 2 backs over here operating with this Ram team. But no one on this Ram team pretty much has fantasy value. Everyone is hurt and banged up. Allen Robinson out for the season. Cooper Kupp, they might as well rule him out for the season. And Matthew Stafford, we don't know when he's coming back. And the offensive line banged up as well. So right here, I know Kyren Williams, he could do some work catching the football out of the backfield. But I don't think it's enough here for him to have fantasy value just yet. So this week, he's a sit. And Cam Akers, he hasn't done much as well with a decent workload over the last few weeks. And he's not really versatile out of the backfield catching the football. So he's a sit as well. Now to the Chargers at the Vegas Raiders. Austin Eckler, one of the best running backs once again this season. PPR machine, catching 6-7 balls, it seems like, weekly out of the backfield. And this Charger offense starting to kick it into gear now with Keenan Allen back the last 2 games. Possibly Mike Williams coming back in this one. And Austin Eckler in a great matchup at a Raider team that really don't stop anyone is a must start, obviously. Now to the Raiders side of things, Josh Jacobs coming off a monster ball games, going over 280 yards from scrimmage last week, going on versus the Seattle Seahawks. He's the definite start. I know there's concern that he might not make it to this ball game, banged up with the calf injury, but obviously if he's going to play, he's a must start each and every week, and he's top 5 right now in fantasy points at the running back position. So if he don't play, it's going to be Amir Abdullah and Zamir White probably is a split over there, and those guys I really won't have fantasy appeal for this week. There will be sits for me if Josh Jacobs don't go in this one. Now, Kansas City Chiefs at the Cincinnati Bengals, possibly the matchup of the week here. And ISIAH Pacheco and JERRICK McKinnon I have as borderline options because this is a ball game where I think we're going to see a lot of throwing of the football for this Kansas City Chiefs team. I know last week Pacheco had 22 carries in that ball game and a solid fantasy outing, but this week here I think we're going to see more passing in the football, and that obviously favors JERRICK McKinnon, even though last week he had under 4 fantasy points, where it was a run-heavy attack for this Chiefs team, killing the clock towards the end of the ball game versus the Los Angeles Rams. So this week here, the Chiefs backfield, I have his borderline options. Now to the Cincinnati Bengals, if Joe Mixon is off the concussion and cleared and ready to go, he's a must start this week here. Decent matchup versus the Kansas City Chiefs. And this is going to be a close contested ball game. And we know last season, this Bengal team knocked off the Chiefs in the playoffs. So right here, Joe Mixon, if he's going to play, he's a start. And if he don't play in this ball game, Samaje Perine is going to be a start. Having a nice fantasy game last week for this Bengal team versus a pretty stout Tennessee defense with 19 fantasy points. And right now, whoever starts in this one is going to be a start this week. Now to Sunday Night Football, Indianapolis Colts at the Dallas Cowboys. Jonathan Taylor, he's looked good over the last few weeks after coming off his ankle injury. And he's pretty much the only guy doing anything of notoriety over there for this Indianapolis Colts team. So right now, I got Jonathan Taylor as a start. He's matchup proof. He's back to almost 100% health. And even versus stout Dallas Cowboy defense, you got to put in the lineup this week. Now to the Cowboys, Tony Pollard and Zeke Elliott. I have his start. Zeke Elliott, a solid ball game last week with 16 fantasy points in PPR leagues. I know Pollard had an off game with only 8 fantasy points, but I think this week here, this Cowboy team, they're going to get off to a pretty decent start on Sunday Night Football versus a Colts team that just came off a bad loss at home versus a mediocre to poor Pittsburgh Steelers team. And Tony Pollard, he's a dynamic player. He can run in between the tackles, and we just saw with backups this Pittsburgh Steelers team run the football pretty well with Anthony McFarland and Benny Snell after Najee Harris left the game. So Pollard, I think, could get back to about 80, 90 yards from scrimmage with a touchdown. Ezekiel Elliott, he's getting the short yardage touches, and he's getting the goal line touches. So he's a start this week. And out to the final game of the week, Monday Night Football, the New Orleans Saints at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So right here, Alvin Kamara, it hasn't been the greatest of seasons here for him, but he's still a solid guy. Low-end number 1 running back, high-end 2 running back this season here for the New Orleans Saints. And this week here, even in a pretty stout matchup at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Kamara's been pretty decent versus this Buc defense the last couple seasons. I'm going to have him as a start, and pretty much the offense runs through Kamara and obviously Chris Olave. And now to the Buc side of things, Rachaad White coming off the start and the massive workload versus the Cleveland Browns in Week 12. So right here, I have White as a start. Even if Leonard Fournette plays both these running backs, I think we're going to see a split over there. White obviously being a better receiver out of the backfield than Leonard Fournette. So right now, White, if he's going to be the starter, he's a must-start. Number 2 solid running back on fantasy owners. And Leonard Fournette, if he does play, I would start him as well. They're not just going to erase him from the offense here. He's still going to get 10 to 15 touches, obviously with short yardage work as well. So that's Week 13 start sit every matchup at the running back position of the fantasy football season.